Like, where do you start?
Yeah, let's say that I just started believing or I'm interested and I've been handed a Bible. Where do you start? How do you read? I think personally I get tied into a ritualistic form of reading where it requires so many steps. And I think maybe being brought back to the basis of like what it is to read the Bible could be refreshing.
Yeah. So even in that sentence, I think there's two things you talked about. Like if you maybe just started becoming interested in maybe the Jewish and Christian text, or you just became like a believer in Jesus, and then you brought up like how you approach it, which you grew up in a church. So I think my advice for somebody that taking the first part of the question that maybe just got interested or just got quote unquote saved, my first thing would be like I would start in the Gospels, and I would really focus primarily on like looking at the interactions of Jesus in the story of him, because that he's like the crux of everything. So I would encourage a lot of reading through those Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and focusing on the stories of the telling, like Jesus, like his miracles, like and how he interacted with people, and then the parables. Obviously, I think that would be like this. Is it weird to say like the safest place to start?
No, not at all.
Because we have to acknowledge the fact that the Bible is a big anthology library of stories and books. And if you just went anywhere, like you could
hurt yourself. Like particularly for someone who's just getting started in their faith and in their belief, you could, I mean, if you just opened it and turned to Leviticus, or you turn to like a minor prophet, like you turn to Habakkuk and was like, what is this?
Or Judges or Chronicles, or there's some crazy and yeah, I think all that stuff is good. I mean, I don't know if it was Paul or Jesus, but like I think it's Jesus and Matthew or Mark, but like says like, you think I came to like push aside the law and the prophets? No, it's like he came to fulfill them. Yeah. So all those things, those stories in the Old Testament are very good and healthy, and there's things that we can learn from all of them. But they all provide a lot of you need a lot of context. And I think the start of when, specifically in the context of accepting Jesus into your life, the next step is to learn, when you just approach the Bible, learn more about the stories of Jesus. And I think if you're a new believer, there's a lot of other things besides just reading the Bible. It's about community. It's about relationship. Those things are all very important. But if you were just saying for the Bible, I would start in the Gospels.
And I would take that a step further. So the Bible in its entirety, I would argue, is the story of Jesus. It's just his time on earth is in the Gospels, right? And the way that I look at it from like a very, I don't know, I consider it like a logical perspective. And if you guys don't think it is, then tell me. But I would actually encourage people to start in Mark, because Mark was the first gospel written historically, according to theologians. And it's also highly probable that Matthew and Luke read Mark before they wrote their gospels. And so there's some stat out there that you can find. There's something like the content between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's something like 72% of it is the same, like the content, and it may be worded slightly differently, but the content is the same. But I would say start with Mark because it was the first one written, closest to Jesus being here on the planet. And then I would go to John, because John is the one that's the most different. It has a bunch of context that's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah.
And so you get the same story, but you get almost two sides of it that are different, right? And then I think that Matthew and Luke kind of fill in the different holes. And if you look at, you can do research on the Gospels of who the authors were, obviously, but also like what their relationship was to Jesus. And there's interesting perspectives in there around, like, there are theologians who say that Luke is actually the gospel of Paul. Because if you take the fact that Luke wrote Acts and traveled with Paul, which is why he was able to write Acts, that Luke really was just basically like a scribe and a doctor for Paul. So there's like a bunch of interesting things there historically that like I just like and I kind of nerd out about. But I would say 100% start in the Gospels. And for me personally, start with Mark, read John, then Matthew and Luke give more context clues.
Yeah. It's interesting with each author. I don't know if you've noticed this, but like they all have their own, like John's obviously, like, I think John's more higher level. He's using words in English like we call love a lot more, where Matthew, it seems a little bit more concerned about checks and balances and punishment and stuff. So it's like they all have their own like kind of color. But where do you think they should start?
Probably in the Gospels is what I would say. I would agree. I remember like in high school, the first time that I sat down to read the Bible, the entire thing, I was like, well, it's a book. Start at the beginning.
It's a big book.
You get into Genesis, you're like, this is cool. Like you get the creation, and then you get into Numbers, and you're like, you get burnt out if you don't know, especially like, I don't even know now what I would find interesting in that, So to say it's from like a beginner standpoint,
you would have to have like a very like scholarly kind of perspective to jump in right away and like read through all of the Old Testament. Yes, there's like a lot of like they're stories, but they're stories of a history of a certain people.
I would actually put the Old Testament into like, you kind of separated them out into like beginner, middle, and expert kind of thing. And I would actually put the Old Testament all the way in the expert section.
So where do you go?
I want to just fill people in the Gospels real quick. So Matthew and John were two of Jesus's disciples. We're with him, right? Mark was not, but Mark was traveled with Peter. And so a lot of people would actually say the book of Mark, just like you can say the book of Luke is the book of Paul, right? Can say the book of Mark is the book of Peter. And that Mark was scribing and translating directly from Peter. So there's a lot of interesting history there that you can go and Google. Just make sure you're checking your sources.
Yes. And check us as a source, because again, not experts.
Correct.
We are going off of what we know.
Correct.